To remind the class a little bit about my background, I'm trained in biology, and particularly uh, cellular physiology and systemic physiology, and did the majority of my research in cellular reproductive physiology. But I've always been very interested in the natural environment and debated about following a degree essentially in ecology and um, outdoor studies, but I was married young and had a family, and I just couldn't see going off to the field for prolonged periods of time, and took a path toward the laboratory instead. So that reflects my interest. So during this particular class, I have had opportunities to learn about energy and nuclear power and a variety of interesting topics, but my heart really remains with the biosphere and what happens to living things, plants and animals on the earth. So let me begin to share. Let's hope that works. I'd like to examine the relationship between climate change and human health. And our talk will touch on some global aspects of human health, but much of the information I'm providing is based on North America. Climate change has two main ways of affecting human health. It can change the severity or frequency of health problems that people already have, um, that are already affected by climate or weather factors. It can create new and unexpected health problems or threats in places where they have not previously occurred. The ways that this occurs is by heat, humidity, drought, forest fires, floods, taking a physical toll on people, which is especially dominant on infants and older adults. Climate changes also foster the movement of pest species into new territories. And humans also move into habitats that are already populated with new or more abundant pest species, and humans are more likely to move during periods of climate change. Now, we've alluded to this. Who is most at risk from climate change? Well, we are all at risk from climate change, but it can be subdivided into different categories. Older adults, low-income groups, indigenous peoples, which include people like American Indians, occupational groups, children and pregnant women, and persons with disabilities or chronic medical conditions. In the United States in particular, and in much of the Western world, the percentage of people aged 65 and older is rapidly increasing. This population is especially susceptible to extreme changes in heat and weather events, with degraded air quality and vector-borne diseases and other factors. Older adults have some unique social factors, which include isolation or living in older structures that make them vulnerable to heat and extreme events, such as hurricanes and floods. They're much more likely to have pre-existing health conditions, such as respiratory conditions that may be worsened by extreme climate. And also, there are often unique mental health challenges in the older population. Depression is not as unusual, but dementia and other cognitive impairments also increase in this age group. Older adults, as we probably all know, are more likely to take medications to treat chronic medical conditions, which include antidepressants, antipsychotic drugs, and diuretics, all of them making people more vulnerable to complications, especially from heat exposure. Low-income groups, it seems like the more problems you have already, the more likely you are to have a negative impact from climate change. People with low incomes are more likely to live in risk-prone areas, such as urban heat islands, in isolated rural areas, or on coasts and other flood-prone areas, often where there is older or poorly maintained infrastructure. They often already face an added burden of air or water pollution that may be worsened by climate events like severe storms. They also have more chronic medical conditions such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, respiratory and kidney diseases, all of which may be amplified by climate change. And due to economic problems, they also are limited in their transportation opportunities. Many are without cars and rely on public transportation. If they live in rural areas, public transportation is largely unavailable, and this may limit them access to health care. Additionally, as a consequence of low income, they are also less likely to have higher education, and this can impede their ability to prepare for, respond to, and cope with climate-induced health risks. Indigenous people have many of the same risk factors as low-income people in America. Many of the indigenous people are already low income, and then they have the added aspect of being of an indigenous tribe. They often live on reservations. They live in rural areas. They may be more exposed to environmental pollutants or toxic substances, and there is a higher incidence of diabetes in most of the American indigenous people. Because of these existing vulnerabilities, especially those who are dependent on the environment for sustenance, such as small local farms, things like wild rice, salmon, other indigenous foods, or they live in geographically isolated or impoverished communities, are much more likely to be exposed to the climate and have lower resilience to climate-related health effects. They also face threats to their homes, their food sources, and cultural traditions from environmental impacts, such as reductions in sea ice, loss of medicinal plants, and effects on the abundance and nutrition of certain nutritional foods. A group that we often don't give enough credit to in society are occupational groups that, particularly those that work outside and those that work indoors in hot environments, for example, warehouses and things of that, where they'd have no access to air conditioning. The outdoor workers are often the first to be exposed to the effects of climate. It may affect their health through increases in ambient temperature, and this is particularly important, we will show. They may experience degraded air quality, extreme weather, vector-borne diseases, and industrial exposures, plus an altered built environment. I'm not exactly sure what they mean about the altered built environment. But agriculture and construction workers are particularly vulnerable to rising temperatures. These workers may also experience socioeconomic disadvantages with limited access to healthcare and limited control over their work environments. So they may not have a choice of whether to go out and do their job when the temperature is 100 degrees outside and the humidity is 90%, unlike many office workers who have a lot more flexibility in their schedules. Military personnel are another occupational group that have a unique exposure to the environment. They may train and conduct their operations in hot field environments and be at risk for heat-related disease, and also at increased risk for certain vector-borne diseases. I think it goes without saying that children and pregnant women would be at risk. Things such as economic status, nutrition and diet, living conditions, geographic area, stage of development of children will affect children's exposure to health threats due to climate change in the US and internationally. Extreme heat threatens student athletes who practice outdoors, and we have seen an increase in spike at the beginning of terms, I think even this past year, of high school students who are suddenly died on the practice field for football, for instance, and other sports. So and students are also at risk in schools that lack air conditioning, and children that are in homes or schools that lack air conditioning are at great risk. Children are especially vulnerable during extreme weather events to injuries because they depend on adults who are monitoring them to plan for escape, to help them escape. And once they have escaped, they often suffer emotional trauma from displacement, the loss of home or school, and exposure to the event itself. Think of things like Katrina, the terrible effects it had on children, and children who have to relocate during hurricanes and tornadoes, and the psychological effects that often happen. The children may have nightmares for some period of time after these events. Climate-related exposures can also lead to adverse pregnancy outcomes, and I think that this probably intersects particularly with pregnant women who are also low income. So we're more likely to see spontaneous abortion, low birth weight, preterm birth, and risks to the newborns and infants in terms of dehydration, diarrhea, and respiratory diseases. And persons with disabilities and chronic medical conditions, they're already disadvantaged. They already have health issues. All it takes is one more stressing factor, and that can push them over. Chronic medical conditions, including cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, diabetes, asthma, and obesity, are likely to increase over the coming decades, resulting in larger populations that will be at risk of medical complications from climate-related exposures. Communities that are both medically underserved and have a high prevalence of chronic medical conditions can be especially at risk. And I will present some data on people with asthma and their responses to climate change. Now, we're talking about climate change, but what we need to remember is that human activity is the ultimate driver behind the climate change, which is driving all of these other things. So human beings contribute to climate change if they increase their consumption per capita, which will also increase greenhouse gas productions. Also, with population increases, this can lead to increased use of resources. It especially impacts people's pressure on the land, where they clear forests for planting, and people move into previously virgin territory that was occupied predominantly by trees or other natural vegetation. As people move into these habitats, they may encounter new health threats, such as viruses that are hosted by animals that are endemic to the areas that they move into. This was where I thought that my entire talk was going to be related to that, inspired by COVID-19. But I realized that although if zoonotic diseases escape past epidemic into pandemic status, they are a tremendous cause of human health and disease, but they are certainly not the most common form of medical threat posed posed by climate change. Additionally, there are various complex social issues that interweave with the effects of climate change and pandemic. But there are some clear examples of where altered land use, which led to close human-animal contact, plus globalization and higher population density, upped the risk that the zoonotic diseases became pandemics. Some examples of zoonotic diseases that became epidemic or pandemic are COVID-19, the various SARS epidemics, the Ebola virus epidemic, and the Nipah virus epidemic, which was confined to Malaysia. These were zoonotic diseases that were transmitted to people from bats. And although the Nipah virus epidemic in Malaysia occurred much earlier than the more recent ones that have been of global concern, it illustrates the pathway and is quite well understood. Essentially, what happened to cause this epidemic in 1998 was prior to 1998, deforestation increased to build new plantations. This was followed subsequently by droughts, not necessarily caused by the building of new plantations, but the drought caused the migration of fruit bats into planted fruit orchards grown by farmers. At the same time, the fruit orchards were homes to piggeries. This may have been, although I didn't find that the pigs may have been able to eat some of the fallen and spoiled fruits, and so this was probably advantageous for their placement. However, the bats that decided to locate into the orchards were hosts of the Nipah virus. The bats transmitted the Nipah virus to the pigs, and the pigs, probably with young pigs being sold, the pigs were distributed to other farms throughout Malaysia and carried the Nipah virus with them, thereby spreading the virus. The pigs then transmitted the virus to humans via secretions in the pigs. So probably began with the handlers of the pigs and then into their families and on and so forth. The Nipah infection led to a very severe form of encephalitis, which was very lethal. 40% of those with severe encephalitis died from it. And the total number of cases was not huge, as it was confined for a short period of time and in Malaysia, but there were 265 acute cases of encephalitis with 105 deaths. Again, this was regionally confined and did not become a pandemic, but it is a lesson for what can lead to human infections when people have a disturbed relationship with the land and with the animals that occupy the land. Excuse me 1 minute. This is a schematic that shows exactly what the sequence of events is for human health outcomes. First, we have the climate drivers, which are increased temperatures, precipitation extremes, various extreme weather events, and sea level rise. These lead to exposure to extreme heat, to poor air quality, to reduced food and water quality, and changes in infectious agents. Food may become contaminated, and various infectious agents may also grow. Additionally, population is displaced. The health outcomes lead to heat-related illnesses, cardiopulmonary illness, food, water, and vector-borne disease, and mental health consequences in stress. Let's see. Oops. The top of my slide. Basically, we're looking at various ways in which human health can be affected, what the climate drivers are, and what the health outcomes are. And some of these aspects I will be presenting some data for, and others I just want you to know about. So we've talked about extreme heat. The climate driver is more frequent, severe, and prolonged heat events, exposing people to elevated temperatures, resulting in heat-related deaths and illness. Outdoor quality may change. The increasing temperatures and changing precipitation patterns particularly foster winds and foster the development of forest fires. This leads to worsened air quality with ozone, particulate matter, and higher pollen counts from the high winds, etc. Also from greater growth of plants that have high pollen. These things can lead to premature death and acute and chronic cardiovascular and respiratory illnesses. Flooding, which has been recently of mind since the recent hurricanes caused flooding inshore in areas that normally don't see flooding. We can have flooding from rising sea levels, from more frequent or intense and extreme precipitation, hurricanes, and storm surge events. We find that we'll have contaminated water, debris, and disruptions to essential infrastructure. There's also an increase in mold, particularly in dwellings, as a consequence of this. Health outcomes are drowning, serious injuries, mental health consequences, gastrointestinal and other diseases. We also have changes in vector-borne diseases. These are precipitated by changes in temperature extremes and in seasonal weather patterns. We'll see earlier and geographically expanded tick activity. One of the best studied of these and important in the United States is Lyme disease. And I'll be presenting data on that. And then there are other things such as water-related infections, food-related infections, mental health from various aspects of climate change, and I will not be discussing those aspects of health. Now, there may still be some climate deniers. I don't know how many there are, but there are many indicators that the U.S. is currently experiencing climate change, and I will provide a few of those indicators. And can people see the entire
Yes.
slide, including part of my screen is cutting off. This is the change in heating degree days. So essentially, the redder the color, the fewer heating degree days. So basically, all of the red and pink and orange states in the United States over a period of time, which I can no longer see, comparing present times to earlier times. So this is present time. This is the changes that have occurred since the previous century. These are cumulative days and not annual days. So for instance, a really red state here would have seen 8 fewer days of needing to turn on the heat, whereas Texas would have seen 2.4 fewer days of having to turn on the heat, whereas there is no change in much of the central southern states. And viewed another way, we look at the difference in cooling days. These would be days in which the air conditioner would need to be turned on. Again, the states that were previously warm also require a greater amount of air conditioning. And I have not converted this into actual days, did not look the data. I did not do the mathematics to look at the data, but it is sort of a mirror image of the other finding. We find that, ironically, although we think of the South as being very hot and warm, this part of the South has actually seen a lowering of the number of days in which they need to turn on the air conditioner. And I decided, because I couldn't find a graph to do this, I entered data into a calculator, and I plotted every 4 years the national average temperature. And this is an average for the contiguous United States. It excludes Alaska and Hawaii. And obviously it doesn't, there's probably no place in the United States where the national average temperature is the ruling temperature, but it gives a sort of one number indicator to see what's happening. And although you can see quite a bit of noise, up and down movement of the national temperature beginning in 1950, there has been a steady rise to the present levels in 2024. And my part of my screen, let's see, this has resulted in about a 3.5 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature over the last century. And I can't really show you that because it's my gallery is completely covering it up, and I suspect the rest of you may also have. Oh, you can see that. Okay.
Yes.
So
this is graph and your notation.
Okay. So parts of the United States obviously have had much higher temperatures. We're not going to go into that, but this is an indicator that we are in a warming environment. Another indicator, which sort of is a lump sum to look at disasters in general, is a normalized view of billion-dollar weather disasters. And this has been normalized so that it is not affected by inflation, comparing cheap dollars to expensive dollars. As you can see, since 1980, the incidence of these billion-dollar weather disasters has increased from around 3 to almost 25 in present time. So this really shows that things have been changing over time. Another way to look at what is happening is a chart of plant and animal behavior and migration. The up arrows indicate a latitudinal shift, and the majority of all of the animals and plants that are marked have been moving north in latitude, not all of them. What we have seen for alpine plants is a contraction of their range. They don't have any up to go to. We also see this happening with a particular plant in Hawaii. Its range, it's at the top of a volcanic area, and its range has been contracting. for most of the plants that are listed, we see that they have been flowering earlier, with the circle is showing advancement. Birds are laying eggs earlier. However, hibernation, which occurs in the winter, is delayed for black bears. And again, hibernation for frogs is also delayed. Fish migration shows a mixed pattern. So all of these are ways to show that things are changing in the United States. And they're also changing in Alaska. This is Alaska over here, and this little bit represents Hawaii. Another thing that is probably particularly of interest to those of us here in Wisconsin is the change in the ragweed pollen season since 1995. And the data end in 2015, and we've had another 10 years, and I can imagine that these circles are really huge by now. The diameter of the circle shows the number of change in days, and the not the entire United States has not been shown because the majority of the reports are in the central part of the country. And this extends up into Canada as well. Okay. One of the better studied factors of climate change and human health that is, I think, easier to monitor than some of the others, and for which there is data, is that increased temperature is a lethal factor for humans. Now, I'm going to present data from 1995, which isn't completely contemporaneous, but it illustrates the effect of heat on death rates extremely well, and it's very well confined. We can see this data is for the Chicago heat surge, and the data are for Cook County. Shown above is the temperature in from June through August, showing elevated temperatures, frequently at 90 degrees, hovering around 90 degrees. But during the week of July 11th through July 21st, there was a spike in the temperature where the daily temperatures rose above 90 degrees and exceeded 100 degrees. And during that time period, we saw an increase in the daily deaths that were attributable to the heat spike. So I think this illustrates more clearly than almost anything else just exactly how lethal heat can be when it is unmitigated. Another bit of data that shows the effect of heat on human health is comparing construction workers to all other workers, comparing the heat deaths. Construction workers are only about 6% of the population of workers, yet they account for around 36% of the total deaths. And there is a relationship looking at construction workers. The ones with the highest risk of death are the cement mixers and the roofers of all of the workers. There's also a effect of ethnicity with Mexican workers who have migrated from Mexico also have a greater risk than other construction workers when compared to them. Now, climate change has increased the risk of Lyme disease in the United States. We saw that essentially temperature has risen, and this is the major driving factor. It has increased the range such that Canada, which was previously free of ticks in various areas, is now afflicted by them. So the ticks have moved north. In addition, the tick life cycle has lengthened and they have become more abundant. The life cycle and abundance are temperature dependent. They are most active above 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and they thrive at high humidity of greater than 85% humidity. This has increased the range of their habitat. So the shorter winters have increased their period, the length of their activity, and also increased and lengthened human exposure to Lyme disease. Now, these spots all represent individual cases that were reported to the CDC throughout the United States. Not all cases of Lyme disease are reported to the CDC, and not all cases of Lyme disease are sufficiently severe that people seek medical help for it. And I'd just like to point out that this blank spot here in Massachusetts is a data collection artifact and is not due to a surprisingly free area of Lyme disease. And this can be shown in another way. This is the change that has occurred over time in Lyme disease instance. As you can see, that Wisconsin and Minnesota have had a significant increase, but the hardest hit areas in the United States are in the Northeast, in Maine, in Vermont, etc. And in case we didn't completely believe to believe it, just looking at these scatter plots and color diagrams, we see an almost linear increase if we normalize the data in Lyme disease instance through the past decades. And this parallels somewhat the rise in temperature that we have also seen. Now, I'm going to present data on forest fires and the smoke pollution from them as a growing threat to human health across the globe. A lot of the data will focus on the United States. Although we have plenty of indicators, good hard data that show cause and effect are not as common, and I tried to find data that showed that. For the past 20 years, the frequency, size, and duration of wildfires have increased globally and in the United States. Globally, the mean duration of the global fire season has increased by almost 19%. In 2021 alone, 9.3 million hectares of trees were globally lost. In 2023, as we read in our book about Canada, and as we experienced as a nation for Hawaii, we saw catastrophic fires in Canada and Hawaii. The estimated costs to the United States in healthcare due to a wildfire smoke are 11 to 20 billion per year. That's quite a lot of money.
Yeah.
And it is estimated that by 2050, the fire season will have increased to 23 days per year over that found in just 2013. And by the year 2100, for air pollution, 50% of the particulate pollution will be due to fires if things continue as they are going today. Now this does not show the frequency of forest fires, showing that forest fires have increased this much. What it does is it shows that the conditions that foster the beginning and dissemination of fires has increased. So these are hot, dry, windy days, and we have seen an increase in these, particularly in the Western United States. This has resulted in many more forest fires, and as an indicator for numbers of forest fires are the amount of wildfire smoke pollution that's been affecting the United States, affecting people in the United States. And the way this is measured in particulate matter less than or equal to 2.5 microns, and the exposure in micrograms of particulates per cubic meter in the United States. And we have seen a very dramatic increase in this parameter in the past 3 years. I will be curious to see what 2024 looks like, but it's too early to have that data just yet. So just even in the past decade, we've seen an enormous increase in wildfire pollution as a result of wildfires. There is significant epidemiological evidence for various adverse health effects due to wildfire smoke exposure. This includes asthma, various aspects of asthma, and we will look at that in a little bit more depth. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, hospitalization and emergency visits, long-term impacts on health function, the actual structure, fibrosis, and other aspects of permanent changes occur in lung function, respiratory infections, lung cancer incidence, and respiratory mortality. We'll also look at that, and we'll look at the respiratory mortality first. Oh, these are some of the pollutants. Most of the data, it's easiest to measure the fine and ultrafine particulates, which are the PM 2.5, and that is a key pollutant. Additionally, carbon monoxide, methane, nitrous oxides, organic carbons, volatile organic carbons, ozone, a big one, and a number of hazardous air pollutants that are recognized by U.S. environmental groups, which include formaldehyde, benzene, and hydrogen cyanide. So we will be providing data on the particulate matter pollution. The recommendations for exposure to particulate matter differ between the United States and the World Health Organization, varying from 35 micrograms per meter cubed for the US and 25 micrograms per meter cubed for WHO. I think I would rather trust the WHO estimate, but that's just the way I feel about it. During the wildfires in Alberta, Canada, the fine particulate matters increased over 50 micrograms per meter cubed from a baseline of 3 to 6. So that was a tremendous increase that people were exposed to for the particulate matter. And during a period earlier of California wildfires, there was measured a median particulate exposure difference of 23.4 micrograms per meter cubed between fire and non-fire days, with some days exceeding an 80 microgram difference. So tremendous. And during the California wildfires, there was an analysis done to see what the effect of the particulate smoke matter had on respiratory disease. So a large number of individuals in America during a period of a decade experienced unhealthy air quality levels where their mean small particulate matters exceeded 35 micrograms per meter cube for more than 10 days due to wildfires. So a lot of people in the US have been affected already by the particulate matter. And then globally, a study has shown that over 339,000 premature deaths a year have been caused by wildfire smoke, and it's far more than from those who lost their lives directly in the blazes. The study that examined how the wildfire smoke affects people globally in terms of mortality obtained the following data, and the intensity of the color indicates the amount of fine particulate matter that they were exposed to. And we can see fairly high levels of exposure in parts of Africa, South America, and in Southeast Asia. And these same areas were looked at to see what the global mortality occurred due to the landscape fire smoke. And we see areas, particularly in Africa, Southeast Asia, and also we do see some in South America, although not to the same extent. These data were analyzed further, and we saw that sub-Saharan Africa had the majority of global deaths due to landscape fire, to wildfires, with Southeast Asia being next in terms of number of deaths, and with fewer deaths occurring in South America. There were significant differences. This is the average over this time period, comparing two different years in which an El Nino and a La Nina occurred. We saw significant differences in the deaths. Significantly more global deaths occurred during El Nino years than occurred in La Nina years. And this was very, very pronounced in Southeast Asia, the difference between the El Nino years and the La Nina years compared to the average. The conclusions from this study were that fire emissions are an important contributor to global mortality. They also, although we didn't present the data, state that the health outcomes could be substantially reduced by curtailing burning of tropical rainforests, which rarely burn naturally. They also concluded that the large estimated influence of El Nino suggests a relationship between climate and the burden of mortality attributed to landscape fire smoke. So if it can happen and show dramatically during El Nino, we can imagine that as the temperatures rise, we will also see, as they rise globally, that we will see an effect on deaths from smoke. So although we get an indication that there are bad health effects due to smoke particulates, there was one study in the United States showed a more dose-dependent response on the health of asthmatics due to smoke in California, and I will show you those data. these are relative risk ratios, not actual cases. Anything greater than 1 shows that the event is more likely to occur. And we found that hospitalizations did show a dose response in the asthmatic patients to the number of particulates in the system, but it was not a linear dose response. There appeared to be fewer responses and probably not statistically significant for COPD patients and for pneumonia patients, although probably if they'd had more samples and more time things, we probably would have seen greater effects. But for asthmatics, for hospitalizations, there definitely was a dose dependency of being hospitalized with serious cases of asthma due to the concentration of smoke particulates. If we also looked at visits to emergency rooms, we saw a more linear response of asthmatics to seeking care during the periods of fire. We did also see some effect at the various highest doses for the COPD patients, but the data are very clear for our dose responsiveness of the asthma patients to the amount of particulate matter in the fires. So I'm basically concluding my presentation, and I just want to give you the idea that there are myriad health problems that people in the United States and the world are exposed to as a result of climate change. We have really only touched on a few of these. We've looked at insect-borne and zoonotic diseases and illnesses exacerbated by forest fires and heat-related deaths. And we've also focused predominantly on North America, although I have presented some data from globally. I think it would take an entire course to study the various aspects of health as related to climate, something we can't do in our short hour. And I apologize for not having my bibliographic materials available for you, but I'd like you to know that I used predominantly public websites that are related to health and to the environment from the United States government. And I use data from 3 to 4 different papers for the actual health graphs on effect of wildfire smoke on people. And I'd like to complete, this will now be my very last talk for the PLATO group, and it is the next to the last class for Pathways to Sustainable Planet. And I said here that Richard has hosted us for over 20 years, and I think it's now been 20 years. Is that correct, Richard?
It's actually about 14, I think. Started in
14.
2010.
Oh, sorry, 14
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
And I've learned a lot, both from Richard and from the group, and I've really enjoyed being part of the group. I'm going to miss our group. I don't know how I will replace it in my life as time goes on, but I'm now open for questions, and I will stop screen sharing. Oh, wait, got the wrong thing here.
Well, I thought that was remarkably comprehensive, Dottie, and I thank you so much for presenting that. It was very much, it was far more comprehensive than I expected. And I'd be glad to pass around your literature, but that was quite an impressive collection of data. Thank you very much for sharing that. We're open to questions now because we've just been going for a little under an hour, and our class has been asked to withhold questions unless urgent. So now is your time.
I'm hoping that people will make general comments, etc.
But what I didn't do, Ken, is I didn't touch any files. I don't want to touch any files until
I'll kick off with a technical question.
Do you
Oh,
think
sorry.
it's
I
okay
didn't
for
know
me to
that
do
was
that? Do you
background.
want to be involved?
somebody
in
could
it?
sorry.
I don't
use
wanna-
their
I don't wanna
phone.
Okay.
step in
Just
the-
let Mert
Okay.
speak.
Hi, Mert.
Hello, Dottie.
Okay, Mert.
Impressive, impressive. You used two words I didn't understand. One was zoonotic, and
Zoonotic.
the other one was vector.
Okay, the vector is a species which carries something to another species. So the ticks are a vector that carry the germ, the Bordetella. I'm not sure I have the exact name of the disease organism. It's actually a bacterium. They carry the bacterium to humans by biting them. So they basically infect, the bacterium grows in deer mice, and then the ticks acquire it from deer mice. And although we call them deer ticks, and they may, be on the deer, they don't actually make the deer sick. So the deer aren't the source, but they do make the rodent sick. And then when they feed on the blood of the rodents, etc., and they give they incubate the bacterium in the deer mice, and then they transmit the disease to us when we go out in the field and when we do our yard work. And I had heard that people in New York State, I seemed just anecdotally to hear of more people getting Lyme disease. And when I see those figures with them just being screaming red, you could kind of understand that they're very, very infected. The data, unfortunately, was all from CDC. I mean, I'm glad it was from CDC, but it didn't include Canada. So I don't know. I think Canada has probably gotten quite an increase, and probably areas that border those of us that have high endemic levels of ticks, are going to show, more Lyme disease too. So it's a problem that at least in some parts of Canada, they didn't previously have, and now they have to deal with it. Sorry.
Second
Oh,
question
and
there, was there not?
there was a second word that's zoonotic. Zoonotic are diseases that are carried in animals. Like the bats are a source of zoonotic disease. They carry a disease and they take it into humans.
Are bats the predominant carriers of the animal kingdom?
The bats are a very frequent carrier of these viruses that have been giving us problems of late. I don't know whether they are I think they've looked at other animals like pangolins and a variety of other things, but of the diseases I showed on the list, the COVID, SARS, Ebola, and the Nipah, all were bat mediated originally. Did that help? Okay.
I was impressed by the asthma following forest fires. That was really dramatic, and I was expecting it, but it was even more than I expected. And of course, from my own personal background, I have mild asthma, and I've noticed that when we have those pollution days from forest fires, that my asthma is definitely worse. But your data sure backed that up. It's quite impressive.
The particulates from the fine particulates, obviously not the really heavy ones, but the fine particulates from forest fires can spread quite a long distance from the origin. I didn't really follow up on exactly how far they travel and, what happens to them. I think it's probably fairly complicated. So it's of concern for those of us who don't necessarily live in areas with a lot of land fires or forest fires, because you can have like the fires that are occurring in Africa and South America. A lot of them are from clearing of land as opposed to just burning trees. So I think the term land fire covers a variety of sins.
The other thing you were very careful to describe what the abbreviations meant. Um, when you say particle size 2.5 microns, that's a third of the size of a red blood cell, which is about 7. And so you can imagine that that is a size that is perfect for slipping down an airway without encountering too much obstruction. It's just, you just imagine a third the size of a red cell. That's easily going to slide down very fine bronchioles and get to the depths of the respiratory tissue. So it's a crucial size to pay attention to. And I'm glad you had those data.
And that size and smaller.
Yes.
Those data. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I had not expected to really discuss forest fires, but it came up in the data, and partly because we had spent the time reviewing that particular book on the Canadian forest fires, and also just every time you turn on the news, you see California burning and maybe some other places as well. So I thought it sort of kind of stuck in my mind that it was, it's obviously not the only thing that can be happening that's bad to health as a result of climate change, but it's something quite dramatic. And I think we also have a lot of things that have happened with increasing hurricanes, but pulling that data together, it's a little bit more complicated as to what's happening. I think all kinds of things can happen. People get injured from debris. They may get injured immediately. They may suffer injuries after the fact when mold grows as a result of the hurricanes. So I really just didn't touch that. It doesn't mean it isn't an important health factor. It just wasn't easy for me to address.
Yeah, it was a very all-inclusive talk, but I think that made it richer. So it was fine. Do I see any more hands up out there? Lee, did you have any
Yeah,
questions?
I had a question that I put in the chat.
Oh,
I was wondering, what do you think is
sorry. I
a
think you
bear end up in their house for one thing, but also I had an example. Oh, yeah, I'm having problems. My internet connection says it's unstable, so
okay.
I might be talking over you. I'm sorry, but I just wanted to mention that after 20 years of gardening here in Sun Prairie, the only problem I had was rabbits early on. So I put up a rabbit-free fence. Okay. So I was fine for several years. All of a sudden, something was climbing over my fence and
Oh,
it ate almost all of my tomato plants, almost all of
wow.
my peppers. And late in the season, harvested all of my corn for me. So we
Oh my
figured with the
gosh.
raccoon, I thought, what's a raccoon doing in town, So why
Yeah.
would it migrate like that?
Well, we have quite a few raccoons that live here in Madison, so I'm not surprised. I didn't realize that you would think it would be that unusual. If they have food, um, they have trees that they can climb. They have I used to see them hiding down in the water sewers. So I don't really know where they hang out. I think that's an interesting question, and I don't know whether raccoons are very opportunistic. And so if people spread out, if there are more people, I think there are going to be more raccoons. People leave food out for their pets. They may put it on the porch. Raccoons will happily come and eat that, and some people think that they're cute and they make the mistake of giving the babies something. And then before you know it, they've set up a telephone line and all of the raccoons are coming. So I don't actually know about raccoon behavior, but I'm not surprised. But it's a shame that they were so clever and that they're very smart too. That's the problem with raccoons. Um, They're
Right, I
quite
set a
smart.
trap for it once and I put some of my new little plants of like, pepper plants in the trap, okay? And that
Okay.
raccoon apparently reached over and got all of those and ate all of those and didn't set off the trap. I was like, how did it do
I love it. I think that people deserve raccoons. I mean, uh, there was a special, I think that it was actually on PBS about the spread of raccoons worldwide. I think
Hmm,
the Japanese thought that they were kind of cute and interesting and imported a few. And now urban raccoons exist, I think, all over the world, and they are extraordinarily clever about what they do in terms
yeah.
of their territories and how they learn what routes are safe to take. But it's been a number of years since I saw it, but it was really a very good program. I'll see if I can find it and maybe send you a link if I can locate, where I actually saw it.
Okay,
Are they,
that would be
are they,
great.
par-
And
are they part of the zoonotic transport system? You didn't
I,
mention them earlier.
no, she's talking, she wants me to explain why there are more raccoons, and I
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah, but
really doing it.
are they
Um,
disease carriers?
well, they are potential carriers of rabies, so you don't really want to be playing with the local raccoons in your backyard. You don't really want them commingling with your pets and things of that sort. So, but I don't think we actually get very many diseases. People don't usually transmit rabies to other people, so it sort of stops at the person who gets bitten, unlike some other diseases, which then become airborne, once you get them. Those are the ones particularly bothersome, things that can be passed from person to person.
I was also thinking that maybe climate change might cause them to migrate because of, I don't know, food supplies changing, or you know what I mean? The difference in temperatures could maybe chase them into the cities for some reason. That's what I was trying to figure out.
I think that raccoons are a lot like people, and if we follow the trends for people, I think raccoons will follow a similar pathway because they have really managed to use human resources very effectively. So that would be my only explanation.
Okay, thank
I
you.
like your story of be careful what you wish for, because I also read that article about Japan, and I think it's quite humorous how they've got way, way more than they ever hoped to have.
In terms of the raccoons,
Yeah.
yeah.
I have a very mundane question, Dorothy. Thanks for a great talk. What's the difference between El Nino and La Nina?
Good question. And I was hoping no one would ask me anything about El Nino and La Nina. The predominant weather pattern is the El Ninos, and we tend to get more severe events from El Nino. And it has to do with the currents in the oceans and the winds. And I can't remember the specifics. I'm really sorry. But how about somebody else taking up the question for me on the El Nino and La Nina? Can anybody step in for me?
I
Doug.
I can only add a little bit. It tends to be equatorial in its distribution, and the Galapagos Islands are a famous place often visited, and they're sitting right on the equator. And so in strong El Nino years, they can have more erratic and warmer weather than La Ninas. But that's about all I can add to the subject. But they typically are tropical.
I might be able to.
How
I
do
might
they
be able to-
decide whether they're going to call them La Nina or El Nino? Is there some?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Okay, the La Nina, the El Nino, I think was first described And it is the predominant weather pattern that changes and causes more extreme weather events. So we have more extreme weather events. And the La Nina sort of follows the El Ninos and is a milder, sort of in the opposite direction of the El Nino. So El Nino has been well characterized and is the predominant thing that is talked about. And the La Nina is kind of like, it's the second one. So that's a very bad explanation, but that's going to have to do for now.
I
Thank
might be
you.
able to add
Oh,
a
good. Thank you.
couple of pieces of information. And I'm remembering this from a course that I took in meteorology just a couple of years ago.
Oh, good, good.
But El Nino, I know that one of the characteristics of it is that there is that both of these are cyclic. And during the El Nino, there is actually a buildup of sea level in, I will say it is in the Eastern Pacific. There's a movement of seawater essentially away from the western coast of South America over eastward. And so sea level actually changes. And you may know that there is an upwelling. I mean, I think we probably talked about this. Richard, you know more about this than I do, I suspect. But there's an upwelling that occurs along the western edge of South America that actually contributes to a lot of the food source and the migration patterns of marine mammals and that sort of thing along that coast. And I believe that this sea level moves away from that coastline, and it then causes a change in the climatic pattern that begins more or less at the equator, but then there is I'm stretching my memory right now, but there is a climatic circulatory pattern that starts just I'll say north of the equator, and it's all well anyway. So that occurs. That's the El Nino. The El Nino is when the sea level rises, towards the east or increases towards the eastern end of the Pacific, and then La Nina is more or less, as far as I know, the opposite of that. And this affects the climatic pattern, and in particular the jet stream. And so then that changes, I guess, the delivery of probably moisture, in the air, in particular to North America, which is what we're more worried about, we're more concerned with. But I suspect it affects other parts of the world as well. I just know that when I was studying this, I just remember the discussion. And actually, I can go back and find my notes, and I can send some information on about it.
I've just, sorry.
If I can raise my hand for a minute.
Of course, yes.
Ellen, while you were talking, Doug, I pulled it up on another screen. El Nino and La Nina are opposite phases of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, a natural climate pattern in the tropical Pacific Ocean. The warm phase of the ENSO cycle is characterized by above average sea surface temperatures in the east central equatorial Pacific. And the Nina is a lowering of that temperature. And those are large enough in the Pacific Ocean to cause major large cyclonic weather systems that mainly hit our west coast. There are similar patterns in the Atlantic Ocean, but not as much because it doesn't have as much driving force, but it does turn into the hurricanes that we've been seeing. It's a similar heating and cooling oscillation, and we'll have more of them because we're heating up the planet. I'm
You're
done.
also
I think it
you're
makes
also going to have more hot, dry winds that can result as a during the El Nino years as well.
it just seems to me that given that
Sorry.
this you know, the sort of the center of the warmer water changes geographically, that causes a change in origin of some of these systems, and so then they progress across in particular North America differently. And northern hemisphere weather is different than is southern hemisphere weather. And actually equatorial weather is quite a bit different than sort of the temperate region. And well, I won't go on any further than that right now.
Okay.
But like I said, I have a bunch of information on this from this course that I took. I just can't.
We did have a speaker about a year ago who talked about the importance of tourists who go to the Galapagos Islands, and they feel they pay so much to go to the park that they have almost greater rights to what goes on down there than the natives who live on a few of the islands. And so there's quite a conflict, and that leads to a lot of interest in El Nino and La Nina, because that's very much part of the world where it's evident. But before we go, I want to, I'll let you go, Ed. I want to, Doug, I want you to give us a possibility of whether or not you would speak to us either later this winter or next spring about your pet topic, which I very much like to hear, and that is the use of
Marine
health,
permaculture.
Permaculture, the health of the oceans, particularly in relation to sea urchins and the
It was out. This particular
growing.
the thing that I sent you was actually about using algae.
Yeah, that's right. And I would love to hear that. And I wonder if we could persuade you to give that talk at some point to this group.
Well, actually, I have this video, which was actually taken during a Citizens Climate Lobby action team meeting that concerns greenhouse gas emissions and actually greenhouse gas removal. And a guy who heads up this organization, I'm going to tell you his name. At least I can tell you the name of his organization.
Would that be available to pass around to this group so we could watch it at our convenience?
Absolutely. You know, I think I forwarded you the link, but I can forward the link to you to get. In fact, I can put the link in the chat here in a minute.
Good.
To the CCL presentation, which is actually relatively short. It's no more than a half an hour. And what I found really interesting about it, mainly because I'm just generally speaking interested in the subject.
Yes.
That this guy's actually working on a real implementation right now, which at least appears to me to be both effective at removing CO2 from the atmosphere and relatively speaking inexpensive. actually quite clever in a way, at least from my perspective. And it's an area that, I mean, for me, if I'm going to put my money into something, I'd like to put it into something that is, first of all, effective, but then more likely to be successful. And the cheaper it is, the more likely it is to be successful.
It's
And
true.
this guy is they're actually trying this out right now in the Western Pacific, and they're thinking about putting in an installation just along the coastline next to Santa Barbara in California right now.
Yes. I'm not getting it in my share sequence. If you could just send me the link, I'll pass it around to everybody.
Yeah, I'm gonna find it here in just a second, Richard, and then
Yeah,
I'll
okay.
paste it.
I'd like to thank Dorothy for what I thought was just a wonderful presentation with a huge amount of detail. One of the things I had CNN on this morning, and one of the things they were talking about is the onslaught of all of these environmental and climate catastrophes that hit us every day, whether it's wildfires or floods or they're just overwhelming us. And they were talking about how some years ago, like when Katrina happened, we talked about it for weeks in the recovery. And here is one happens today, and then the next one happens 2 days later. They all just get swept under the carpet there. So we don't even think about these fires or floods or some of the things that are happening because of the environment. And it occurred to me that this is, the paradigm of the tragedy of the commons is that whereas individuals, we don't see ourselves as a contributor, as countries, we don't see ourselves as a contributor, or as companies or industries, we don't see ourselves as a contributor, but in total, we're, certainly messing things up. But trying to get what you presented today out to the average individual who just doesn't see their impact on doing anything worthwhile, or again, countries or companies or industries, it doesn't really matter, is, how do you get people to act in differently? And I'm very concerned now with the new regime coming in January that the focus, we had no focus on environment at all in the recent election. And I think the outcome of the election is going to make it go in the wrong direction. So how do we, as individuals here, all, believing that this is real, that we need to change things, and we probably, I would imagine all of us here are individually doing things that are positively affecting the environment to the degree we can, but how do we do more? What action can we take?
My feeling is with the coming regime change where they will try to foster the production and use of fossil fuels, is that we don't start buying gasoline powered cars, that we buy EVs even if we don't get a subsidy, and that we continue on regardless of what official governmental policy is. So in our buying behavior, we can make decisions. And I think that I would feel better if at least the newly elected president were going to put cabinet members in that had some expertise in areas which they're going to administer. I was just, even for him, I was just totally shocked by his suggestions for the majority of the slots. A few of them made good sense. People had legislative or other experience, but others, it's just kind of like he's sort of like, okay, you voted me out once, I'm going to pay you all back now. It's kind of like, here's what you get. So I think that we just have to do our best, and maybe not turn on the news for those of us who are not happy with the new regime, and there may be others who are. But those of us who are not happy, maybe we shouldn't keep a 24-hour vigil on the news, because it'll just the idea of climate change affecting your mental health. Well, too much TV viewing of politics is probably going to affect your mental health for the next 4 years. So
Agreed.
Yeah, we have a member here, Alan Pentecoff, who was so enamored with his EV. He had a nice little Bolt, Bolt, and he bought one for his wife. So now they have two EVs in the family. And so hats off to Alan for starting the ball rolling. They're not nearly as expensive as a Tesla. They don't come with the negativism of Elon Musk, and they're pretty good little vehicles. So hooray to Alan for his good work.
You know, I want to interject something here, because we're talking about solutions at a scale that would perhaps make a difference. And one of the ways of dealing with really the upcoming administration is to take advantage of what they have, at least so far, expressed interest in. One element of that has been placing tariffs on everything. So it turns out that I've talked many times about citizens' climate lobbies, fee and dividend, or carbon pricing policy. One important part of that is a border adjustment, and it turns out that that the border adjustment really looks a lot like a tariff. It actually generates it can generate significant amount of money. Carbon pricing itself generates a lot of income. So we have a problem in this country. We already know we have a big budget deficit that needs to be addressed. We have an administration that may be focused on tariffs, and we actually have other countries around the world that are going to be placing tariffs on us for if products that we produce are produced at higher carbon intensity than products produced in their countries. And so it's anticipated that this will be coming from Europe right now, coming from Canada, and a number of other countries around the world that are going to be doing this. And it turns out that this border adjustment can actually result in an interest in the climate issue without even knowing it, because people and countries will be trying to outdo themselves in proving that products that they're producing are produced at a lower carbon intensity than products from other countries in order to avoid these tariffs. And so there's already legislation that's being introduced and supported in a bipartisan way in the U.S. Congress right now. And there's a likelihood that if anything happens in Congress within certainly the next 2 years, that's where the focus will be. So it's important, to put your thinking cap on and not just assume that nothing can be done. You guys just have to be smarter than the guys you're dealing with, and appeal to what they're interested in. And I think that's something that we can all do. Hey, we're all trained to be problem solvers. So I think that it's important that we not throw up our hands and give up. It's more important to think about this.
Have to dig out the title, and that is an item that I have on my list to look up. In fact, just
so there is actually a bill that's been introduced in
That's what
Congress
my
right now. It's called
question
the
was,
Prove It Act.
months ago.
Now, what kind of act?
We should have
Called the
adopted
Prove It Act. It's actually a preamble to what I would call a border adjustment, and
not off the top of my head, but it is a
its intention is to
question I have also.
is to identify what the carbon intensity is for certain key industries in the United States, and compare that carbon intensity to those industries around the world, to demonstrate that in particular for some of these we in this country are superior to
Okay.
other countries around the world.
Do you have any?
So
Doug,
there's already an interest in this, and this I would say this would tie into some of Trump's interests. So, bear that in mind.
can I ask, Doug, are other countries already applying this tariff to other nations on their goods? So they're,
Europe, yeah,
sorry.
so you may know that Europe has a carbon pricing policy in place, and they're getting ready to. I believe it may start in 2025 or 2026 to apply this this border adjustment to goods coming into the EU. And I believe that Canada likewise has a similar policy in place. I don't know exactly when it kicks in. I don't know off the top of my head, but there are other countries around the world that have carbon pricing in place at relatively low prices, but they are doing things.
Okay. Are you going to be coming into this area to sit down with them?
And
So-
Richard,
I also,
Richard, can you
Richard,
put
I
Stephen
put
on
that
mute?
link in the chat. You'll find it there, and you can actually share it with people if you want to.
Richard, you might
Did
want
you-
to put Stephen on mute.
Richard, can you mute Stephen? Or
I'll be there at 1:30.
Yeah, just
Well, it's Nachman who is speaking, I think, over us. And
oh, it's Stephen. Stephen is speaking.
he's on the phone.
hold it just a
And-
minute. I'm
and
not
he's-
able to get it. Could you,
Family.
I think you have Richard, you have the capability, because you're a presenter or whatever, a host, to mute people.
Oh, I can mute him. Sorry, I realized that I'm a host. I didn't realize where the mute
well, you
button. I
can
just
do it.
and now I'll unmute him because he's finished with his conversation. Sorry, by the time I found the button, it was too late. Sorry. It's okay.
One last thought. Dorothy, I came in a little late at the beginning because I had a phone call, but I really enjoyed your presentation. I thought it was well organized and followed a good train of thought. And just because I saw this last night, I would encourage everybody to try and see Common Ground.
Common ground. Okay.
Common Ground. If you haven't heard of it, it's about land degradation, preservation, mainly in the United States, but it would apply anywhere.
Was that a PBS program?
No, it's a movie
Oh, it's a movie. Okay.
presented regarding preservation and handling of land so that it doesn't go
give me a minute.
depleted and misused.
Okay. Thank
So-
you for the suggestion.
Well, thank you for the presentation. And thank everybody for coming today.
I
know-
wanted to ask Doug another question about, Doug, are you still with us?
Yeah, I am. Yes, I am.
Okay. My question is, in terms of these potential border tariffs, is this something that China is also doing or not?
China, believe it or not, China is doing more about the climate than certainly we are here in the US. And they're doing it for really a couple reasons. One is that they don't have a Clean Air Act, or didn't have a Clean Air Act like we have for the past, 50, 60 years. And so their air quality is horrible, and they have to do something. And so they are simultaneously growing economically, which is offsetting some of that work. But I'm sure that if we impose tariffs on China, there will be a tit for tat. So,
Right.
That's just going to happen. And depending on how these things are formulated, the economic impacts, while that's not really a subject of this particular group, will be substantial, and they aren't going to make a lot of people happy. We can all anticipate that.
Okay. I don't see any other hands raised at this point. Richard has briefly stepped out, so I don't know the protocol for
You're in
stopping the
charge.
meeting. Pardon if he's not actually here. But I don't want to keep people if we don't have any further lines of conversation. Is there anything that anybody wants to discuss, since this is one of our very last Plato classes that Richard will be hosting for us? And we have one more following Thanksgiving, also dealing with nuclear energy. I forget the exact title of the talk, but this is probably the last sort of general conversation as a group that we'll have. So I don't know if anybody else has anything that they want to bring up, related or otherwise, or whether we should. Yes, Mert?
Only on that flow of this particular PSP. Richard was talking about inviting Doug or encouraging Doug to a future presentation. Is PSP going to continue under a separate host?
I think that Richard had reached out in conversations to me, had reached out to some of our membership and some of our former members, and hadn't had any positive bites. And I think that he may have already told the coordinators that this particular class, as a regularly scheduled thing, may not be held. I don't see any reason why there couldn't be ad hoc kind of meetings if, Richard uses our mailing list. And I really don't know, but I didn't think that the class was going to be offered. That was my impression. It was not going to be offered in the spring unless somebody else decides to take it up.
Yeah, from my coordinator, Kathy Berman, who is his coordinator, that is the plan from Plato. So I was surprised that he even implied that Doug might have a class structure to present to.
Well, I think I was a little surprised too, and it may simply have slipped his mind after 14 years of the class. Richard, we're speaking about you in your absence.
Sorry, I have to, I'm on a diuretic. I have to jump up every now and again. What was the question?
Well, we were discussing, you had sort of invited Doug to give a talk, but we thought that the class was not going to continue into the spring. And we were trying to confirm whether that in fact is true, whether there will be a Pathways to Sustainable Planet class in spring or not.
I'm certainly not going to be available, but if anybody would like to carry it on, I've written to Tony Praza, and Tony's not interested in. Nobody I'm aware of in the class would like to. So I have a feeling that it may cease, but I would certainly be happy to support it in any way I can, should someone like to pick it up and go with it. I'm not unable to pick up the thing that you sent, Doug Edwards. So I think if you just send me the link, I will
Okay.
pass it around to everybody by snail mail. I mean by email, so that
Yeah.
everybody has that link. And then if you or anyone else would like to give some sessions next spring, please know that I would be happy to support it in any way I can.
So Richard, would this be with you simply contacting us independently of the official PLATO group, just sending out an invite via email? Is that how you would do it?
Yes,
Using your
to the
okay.
Video that Doug was recommending about it was an interesting video to deal with more efficiently with kelp and lowering and raising it at different times of the day, so they could use it more efficiently. And I think it was an excellent.
Yeah, I can describe it really quickly. It's this guy, what he's doing is he created essentially a frame, a floating frame, was floating on, I'll say, barrels, and I believe that it occupied the ones that he's doing right now, maybe as much as an acre or something like that. And so they're testing to see, first of all, you're growing kelp so you can actually sell the kelp that you're producing in a market and make money off of it. So you're farming. But in addition to that, there's a certain fraction of what you're growing that simply falls off of this frame and heads to the bottom of the ocean, where it degrades, but it essentially sequesters carbon at that point. And there's a significant significant amount of this, sufficient amount, that it actually removes considerable CO2 from the atmosphere. And what they found was that, okay, if you're floating this thing on the surface, if a storm comes by, you have a problem. And so they actually had an idea where they would sink this thing at night when there's less light hitting the platform or the frame, and then they would raise it up again. And to do this, they came up with a bunch of solar panels, I guess, that energize the motors that are used to raise and lower this frame. And this is all relatively inexpensive. And this presentation actually demonstrates that, boy, it's certainly in our lifetime, the people on this call, the kelp bed along the coastline of California has changed dramatically. Richard, you know a heck of a lot more about all this than I do.
I actually gave a lecture on the oceans a while back, and I included photographs of this circular device. It was quite nice imagery. And so I've given some of that already and photographs from it when I did some of my oceanic talks a while back. And so, yeah, I'm all for it. And
It just seemed like it seems like it, you know, he's done some calculations, and he presents this guy who does this, he's part of an organization called Climate Foundation.
Mhm.
You can find it online.
Yes.
But I mean, I could give you
That guy was supposed to give us a talk, and I didn't realize that it was on a famous Jewish holiday, and he didn't either, and so he didn't show up. I think it was the first day.
No. I think that was Fikowski or something like that. That's a different guy.
No. This is the guy.
I think that the guy I remembered that was this year or maybe early this.
Yeah, it was the first session this year.
Yeah, that was this guy Fikowski or something like that.
I thought
believe
he
that's
was
his-
into the iron,
Yeah,
the
he's
iron
into
mining,
iron fertilization or something like that.
and that's
which is
different
which
from
is-
your project,
Yeah,
right?
which is actually a different, it's another technology that has been discussed. And there's there are a lot of questions about that. But this thing that I'm talking for which this particular video or recording concerns, it actually has to do with growing kelp. I'll say the sort of farming kelp or farming seaweed, whatever you want to call it. And it's actually a real commercial endeavor. At least from what I've seen so far, has some promise because it's really more or less paying for itself. And that's, it seems to me, is it's more likely to be successful if in particular, given you know, our situation budget wise and politically wise, it's more likely to be successful.
Good.
It's just something that I found really interesting.
Yes.
That I wasn't as aware of as perhaps you might have been.
Well, I'll send that link around to everybody, and we can look forward to that. Thank you. Any other comments or questions? It's almost coming up on 12 o'clock.
Well, thanks, Dottie, for a great presentation. And thank you, Richard, for a wonderful 14 years. As I'll echo Dottie's comments, that I really did learn a lot. And from my perspective, it was wonderful to be amongst a bunch of people who are also passionate about EVs like I am. And so hats off to you. I really appreciate all your hard work, Richard, because it is a lot of work to do all the preparations that you did for us over quite a few years there.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that you enjoyed it, and it's been very pleasant for me.
I want to
have a
echo
wonderful
that.
class.
I want to echo that. Thank you so much, Dottie, and Richard, thank you so much for the 14 years.
Yes, definitely.
You can't be replaced, unfortunately.
No.
Who's talking there?
That's Julie.
Julie.
Julie, thank you, Julie. Appreciate that.
So,
As somewhat of a newcomer, I certainly agree with everybody. It's been a pleasure, and we'll keep you linked in. Hopefully we can continue in the future.
Good.
Yeah, well, with Friends of Fishing, we're linked in, Stephen, and I think we will have an impact on some future inputs as well at the PLATO level. So I'd love to see PLATO continue in some function or other. We'll certainly support it any way I can.
The breadth of your knowledge, Richard, has baffled me. You start out as a nuclear focused guy, but everything from kelp to weather to concrete to, it's phenomenal. You have got the capacity to know and understand the broadest range of technologies I think I've ever met.
Thank you. I'm not very good on concrete, but that's Doug's specialty. But I sure have enjoyed learning. It's a two-way street, PLATO, and I really enjoyed my time and sharing ideas with you too. So it's been really great. Thank you.
And we wish you the best with your health issues.
Thank you.
We'll keep you connected.
Do my best to stay in touch.
You can run, but you cannot hide.
Okay. Okay. Well,
Definitely.
it's been great. And thank
Thanksgiving,
you.
everybody.
Okay. I encourage you to come next week. I was going to do it myself, but I asked Neil Alexander to do it for me. And I asked him a lot of questions and particularly about Canadian versus American hydro. A lot of people don't realize, but there's a huge cavern that runs underneath Niagara Falls, Ontario. They say that you could put a church in the size of this tube. It's such a huge cavern. And that's called the Beck, I think it's called the Beck Memorial hydro system. And I think it's significantly bigger than the one on the American side. And so that has been providing a lot of electricity right up until I was in medical school. And then gradually, Ontario needed more and more energy. And so they went to this CANDU reactor, CANDU standing for Canadian Deuterium Uranium or heavy water reactor. And it's worth listening to. We've heard from Neil before, but I asked him a lot of historical questions that I think he'll address. And I think you'll find that where he's focusing on, he's going to the boiling water reactor, not the more complicated pressurized reactor. Boiling water reactors are really pretty simple, and they don't operate at such a high temperature, slightly less efficient, but they're very simple. And they have several that are now can be used in isolated parts of Canada. And so they're talking about that, but it'll be mostly going on about these huge centers where CANDU reactors are making more energy than any other reactors in North America, and keeping out the use of coal in contrast to Wisconsin. So they're doing a great job, and I think that you'll find his talk next week interesting. So I encourage you for that one. And so we'll see you then. And again, thank you, Dottie, for a wonderful presentation today. I enjoyed it.
Thanks. Bye all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Happy Thanksgiving.
You.